welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Citizen Illegal by Jose Olivares for National Poetry Month. Last episode, we discussed the third section of the collection and its major themes. This episode, we will discuss the last two sections of the collection, and we are joined this week by EPCC student and English major Alejandra Flores.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hey,
Thank you.
yeah, it's nice to have you on board. And as we were saying before the show, we wanted to just get your thoughts on how Citizen Illegal was, how you felt it was, in the Chicano studies class that you were taking with Rich Yanes, who's a good friend and colleague of ours.
It's been a unexpected experience for me. I really wasn't expecting to like the class to begin with. I was never really interested in Chicano literature per se. But once I started the class, I really started enjoying it. And I think a big part of it is due to Professor Yanez. He's very good at engaging the students and allowing us to participate in the class. And then once I started actually reading the books that were part of the curriculum for the class, I started realizing just how interesting and important all this is, especially being, I'm Mexican American, so it's a big part of my culture. And I never really bothered thinking about things like this. But like I said, once we started reading the books and we really started getting into the literature, I realized just how good quality authors we have, and some of them local, and they create a big impact in who we are, especially living here in the border. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Rich is Professor Yanes, as you call him, is a great spokesperson for Chicanos and the Chicanx movement and Pasos as well. Shout out to them. I'm glad that it kind of has worked out to have you here. We wanted to kind of get someone who's in the classroom and in the virtual classroom now, but who's been learning about this book through the classroom. And so as we had said, and as Vanessa had mentioned, we're looking at the last two sections. And
right.
Vanessa is at UTEP, so she's an English major there. And then Richie here, my colleague, is here with me at EPCC. We've interviewed Jose a couple episodes ago, and now it's just the last two sections. And so each of us was going to do like a poem or two, looking at section 4. I think, Vanessa, did you have you said you had Mexican Heaven?
I do, yes. So this one's actually another one of my favorites, just because it's only food, which is a big theme that we talk about here on the podcast. I don't know. I think it just shows like all of the different foods that we enjoy, and part of it, it kind of represents like our idea of heaven, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially those tacos.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. I like the alliteration there too in the first line, tacos, tamales, tostadas, tortas.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is as delicious as this poem looks, reading it. I also think it's delicious in the way it sounds. And that's, I always like to call attention to the music and the language. And so, right, you mentioned the alliteration. You have a lot of elements of prosody in here. And I think that it's worth reading the poem out loud to hear the words leave your tongue and your mouth. And I think, food is culture. So I think it's also a great opening to this section, right? Because there's a lot of poems that allude to food, to eating, and this connection to love.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know, but if I say it out loud, it'll make my mouth water.
And I think that's the point,
Right? Yeah. And it's also a good example of variety. There's a lot of variety in Mexican food that I don't think you necessarily see with American culture. So there's a lot of things represented here in terms of like the drinks and the different soups, menudo, pozole, and the different sandwiches, and so I think that's kind of shows, just that the list could go on. It's just three lines, but there's a lot more but this is just kind of a taste of it.
Right. And even in just three lines, it encloses so much already.
Yeah. No, yeah. And I was going to say that, like, in contrast to the other ones, I think it might be the shortest one, or at least like tied with the other ones in terms of how short it is. But it does draw like a sharp contrast with the other Mexican heavens that are more like about people. This is all just food. There's no actual people in this one.
Except there's no food without people, right? I mean, I guess there technically is in the wild, but the recipes that we create. When I say food is culture, it's like the recipes we create, the ways in which we create ensembles and tastes and for palates, and the stories that go behind the foods as well.
For sure. Ale, do you remember talking about this one in class with Professor Yanez?
Unfortunately, we didn't get this far in class. We had just started discussing it right before spring break. So we didn't get this far. I just kept reading the book on my own because I found it very interesting. I do have to confess that at first I had a hard time reading it. I was looking at it more. We had been reading Drink Cultura. That was the first book we read, and it's essays. So I had been looking at this book with that mentality when the essay type of reading, and this is more poetry. So when I started reading it, it was a little hard for me with the first few poems. And then I started discussing this with Professor Yanez, and he was like, "Oh, you're looking at it wrong. Go look at his YouTube page and stuff." And I started researching. And then I just couldn't put the book down after that. But no, we didn't get this far. It was
what changed?
Unfortunately,
what changed for you?
I think reading them out loud helped a lot. Especially because the first few poems, the punctuation is not what I'm used to. But then I started reading them out loud, and it started making more sense. And then I started making connections just to my history, my culture, the things I grew up with and everything. And that's when like something sparked and it just clicked. It made sense.
Right on.
That's awesome. Vanessa, did you have the next one too, or you, Richie? I remember you guys mentioned this one in the pre-show. I did. When you're in love.
I really liked it. Did you have it too, Vanessa? Or?
Well, you mentioned you were going to talk about it, so I was just going to jump in.
I mean, yeah. So one thing I really appreciate about Jose, is we've talked about it before, is there's a lightheartedness too. The humor, and I just think you get these awesome titled poems like "You Get Fat When You're in Love," and what's more human to relate through art? I know we talk about this a lot in literature, and when we look at art, is that once it's out in the world, it's now the audiences, and so I can relate to this. I just think it's a pretty interesting way of talking about love, relationships, essentially. When someone gets in a relationship, I think you get a little more comfortable, and you get love is food, it's eating, it's enjoying yourself, and it's kind of a way of talking about heartbreak. A lot of something that we've talked a lot about already in previous episodes is the way Jose can make a turn in a poem, a shift, and then of course here the shift is getting your heart broken, and I like the way he bridges it, he connects it with this concept of, when you're skinny, everyone rushes to compliment you. What's your secret? What's your secret? Nobody ever thinks any other possibility. And it ends pretty heavy with that nail in the coffin of call it the broke heart diet. Love left you, then you left you, and all you have is this disappearing body. I can relate to this. I've been in a very comfortable relationship where, maybe it's a little too comfortable. Like we never did much except just stay at home and eat and be comfortable. And that was nice. But when that ended, I can relate to the idea of love left you, then you left you. It's just trying to like refigure who you are. And, depression hits in so many different ways. So I just thought it was a nice kind of break in this collection, where a lot of it's like political and about identity with ethnicity and race and so on. This one felt human in another way, dealing with lost love and the connection to food and changing body sizes. So that's what I thought.
It's universal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you guys think about this one.
I like the last line of the first stanza where it says, "You make music with this love, carry your song." And this idea of like, this music is like your happiness. And then at the end, it's like the sadness. So I like that contrast of it all.
Ale, did you think anything about this one? Or?
Yeah. When I first read it, I thought it was funny because it was so true and relatable. And then I looked into it, and there were some parts of it that called out to me, like that last line that Vanessa mentioned: "You make music with this love, carry yourself like a song." That really spoke to me. My husband is a musician, so it just really touched home. But the part you said also, when you get skinny, everyone rushes to compliment you. I was thinking of, maybe my family's a little different, but in my family, when we get skinny, we're like, "What's wrong? What happened? Are you okay? Are you sick? What is something bothering you?" And it's just the way we are. We worry about each other. But then the people outside that don't really know want to know your secret. They want to know what your secret is. And sometimes it's just out of being nosy. Not so much as, worrying.
Oh, yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because there are several other poems in the previous sections where, it's exactly that. It's like people's outside perceptions, and a lot of it there's a fakeness to it. I use that term. I don't really like it that much, but, it comes up in several other poems. And so I would agree with that assessment there.
But it was good. I liked it. I thought it was funny. It was real. It was a little bit of everything, and it just calls your attention.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
And I like the form too. It kind of it's a poem that physically also, it starts off a little too much on the sides or whatever, and then and it kind of just gets trimmed down as the stanzas kind of become themselves, with that broken heart disease or whatever, yeah. And I think it's an interesting contrast, or maybe kind of fits, well with this kind of Mexican heaven, as a pair, because it kind of showing, it's some love, just like food, is all consuming. And, so they go hand in hand, just like you were saying, Richie. And so it's kind of, the food itself, is love. It's like you were saying, it's part of your culture, but it's also like making it, consuming it, appreciating it, that in itself is a form of love, so I don't think it even has to be another person, I think it could just be like like me, I love Mexican food, that'll be the hill I'm willing to die on for it, and so even that in of itself could make you, like, I think fall in love with eating it, even if we know, it's very greasy and all
it also, it's kind of an extension or a reflection of, I tried to be a good Mexican son from section 3, where, talking about the love, even though he's struggling with like trying to be the good Mexican son, in the end, his mom still feeds him the frijoles, right? And she has the pot ready for him.
Right.
Another thing it made me think of was the saying, "The stomach is the way to a man's heart." Maybe that's why we gain weight when we're in love.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I was gonna say what you said about the how people actually get worried when you look like you haven't eaten much. And that kind of reminds me of Julia in when she goes to Mexico in the "I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter," which I remember you said that you guys were going to read.
We just started that one.
Nice.
Yeah. So there's a scene that reminded me of that. But did any of you have "If Anything Is Missing"?
I wanted to touch on this one a little bit because I feel like it goes back into all of the other themes that are mentioned previously in the collection. This whole idea of like struggling with these two identities that you feel like you have rather than combining the two and embracing both of them. It's this idea of struggling of, well, which one am I really? So there's a couple of lines that I wanted to mention towards the big.
And just to be clear, could you give the whole title just in case a reader doesn't have the book?
If anything is missing, then it's nothing big enough to remember. So it starts off with mentioning the birthplace of his parents and his birthplace. And then it says, you are here and here, which kind of is his way of saying that he's in both places. And then it goes on to say, you are born both places. Celebration cigars here and here. So again, it's like this reiteration of he's in both places and hasn't quite figured out how to combine the two because he has both of these. And then it says, the countries go to war. And it's hard to remember you are loved by both sides or any sides. And it's, again, this idea of like, who am I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that analysis about the struggle, that like you mentioned, I think you mentioned that like it's like what we've seen in his other poems. And to me, the lines that stuck out to me the most were about the Rio Grande. There's no Rio Grandes. Like here you are safe and whole, and there is no Rio Grande splitting you. And it's of course the Rio Grande is right here with us, and it's something that does divide along with the wall. But it's kind of the idea of how there's harmony, when like there's celebration, there's tortillas and tacos and stuff.
Takes you back. I like when I read the kitchen is hot with tortillas and tacos here, I started thinking of like birthday parties or Sunday afternoon get-togethers and the tias cooking in the kitchen, all the kids playing outside, and the dads drinking a couple of beers, and just takes you back.
Yeah.
And then another line right below that is when it says, one day you wake up and the voice in your head speaks English. That to me was the most powerful line of this poem, because for me, my first language is Spanish. I didn't grow up speaking English. And I realized one day, when my tios were telling me words in Spanish that I couldn't understand, that my thoughts had shifted. My mind was thinking in a different language. And I was little when I started speaking English. I was, I think, like in 4th, 5th grade. But back then I could understand it all. And now if I want to make something coherent or for it to make sense, I have to think of it first in English, and then I have to translate it, and then I can say it. It's before you know it, it changes. Something inside you changes.
Yeah, there's definitely the line that really hit me was like, this section is filled with love. It's also filled with music. And in the poem before, he ends with like this idea of guitar strings. So when the wind blows, we can follow the music home. It's kind of like this last line. It's very musical. And so in this poem that we're talking about, if anything is missing, the last line to me is this kind of guitar string chord as well. That's kind of reflecting this whole Chicano identity of this idea of getting your education and moving forward. This is what he's talking about here at the end. And this line here of it's hard to tell what you lost, what you kept, and what the price really was. It's a good kind of just kind of a reflection of the confusion of trying to reconcile those multiple identities when you're.
It's kind of tragic, like what you all were saying, like you, Ale, about how you resonated or connected with that line about speaking in English all of a sudden and forgetting your mother tongue. And you, Vanessa, about like juggling, different cultures and identities. And in the poem, that second half of the poem, it kind of like, if you now looking at it again, in your all's context, it does make it tragic, that like you're happy to be so American now, as it says, you must be so happy. I mean, to me, I kind of read that sarcastically, because you do gain the American dream, like you graduate, but we've seen that in other poems with like his brother, and like you lose like the memory of your grandparents, your own tongue, old photos fade down. So there's a certain melancholy and loss that, just like you were saying, Richie, in that last line, kind of makes you realize, well, what did I sell out, or, I mean, it's kind of interesting that you, Ale, are in a Chicano class, because I'm sure you guys have talked about like, what does it mean to preserve your culture, in your roots?
Yeah, it's hard. Once you submerge yourself in a new culture, which is what my family did when we came here, it was hard to not embrace and even learn to like and love parts of who you become, of the things that are surrounding you. But there's that part of you that longs for the way things were, and I mean, it's inevitable. Things that will continue to change constantly, but there's always that inner battle, between who you are, who you're becoming, and who you will end up being.
Yeah, well said.
For sure. Well, next up, I don't know if any of you had, well, I know you, Vanessa, probably had the other Mexican Heaven, but
I like that one for its imagery. If I were teaching a poetry class, which I do from time to time, I'd like this one for the images he creates. And so sleep apnea, of course, is a pretty serious kind of sleep disorder. I think he, just by talking about it, I think brings up some interesting cultural things as well. When you have sleep apnea, you feel like you don't get that much rest. Like even if you sleep, you wake up feeling tired, and that's what he's kind of talking about here. And how even then, going back to this kind of comment on society of how colleagues compliment the grind, like, oh, we're working hard. And like, I relate to that so much in the sense of, I get into so many things and events, and, sleep becomes this hard thing. And so I've heard it. I've heard that, like, yeah, you're working so hard, keep at it. And it just, again, there's maybe a little bit more to it than that. But again, I just want to briefly point out, I really love some of the images he creates here. The moon tries to escape my mouth, stars glitter my tongue, a lemon wedge of night sky under each eye, and then the way he carries the evening behind him like a black velvet cape, thick enough to swim in, to sleep under. If I were teaching it, imagery, I'd definitely show people this poem.
I just thought it was so funny how he ended it. I literally laughed out loud when I read it. When I have a medical condition, the doctor tells me sleep apnea. I say, yes, I am the son of immigrants. But what does that have to do with sleep? That was so funny.
Yeah, I mean, what you mentioned, Richie, kind of aligns with what she's, Ala's saying about the grind. Because, with immigrant culture and immigrants and Mexican culture, like artwork is kind of what you do, like I remember Jose mentioned his parents were, there's a lot of hand labor, and here in El Paso, of course, like
a lot of essential workers.
There's a lot of that, and that it kind of becomes a luxury to be able to know that, well, this is a condition.
Wow, that's just a really quick, brief thoughts on that one.
Cool. Well, next one I think is so second to last Mexican Heaven. Vanessa, what did you think about
this one? I like this one as well. Well, I like all of Mexican Heaven, but it's kind of goes back into the whole not illusions, but the way that he makes these religious figures be actual people that we deal with in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that he mentions Jesus is actually Jesus, and this idea of having the tattoo. I think it's our culture, I think, is something that many kids do, is they get like tattoos of their moms. And so I think that that's interesting, that it's something kind of played into as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. Good draw out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also the veneration there for La Virgen, that in Mexican culture, I think we've talked about this before, that, Virgen de Guadalupe is kind of exalted. And so it's Jesus, right? Jesus, but he himself is kind of still worshiping, Virgen de Guadalupe, right? And so, yeah.
Hey, mom is mom.
Yeah, on an artificial level, it made me think of that meme where it's like a family praying at the table and they say, "Thank you, Jesus, for this food." And then there's an image of a farm worker who says, "De nada," or it just shows a man working in the fields. That was like the artificial kind of reading. But in another sense, though, it just kind of makes me think this idea of Jesus being reincarnated every day and no one on earth cares all that much. It just kind of maybe I think of some of the religious hypocrisy you see where, they say if Jesus were alive today, the ones that they we read about and worship would not really accept his ideas. I don't know if you guys have seen that or heard those kind of comments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I also, though, thought of, with that line, turns out he gets reincarnated every day and no one on earth cares all that much. I was thinking of all the people that are poor, that are sick, that are in need of you. And because they say, like Jesus comes to you in the form of the beggar or whatever. But no one cares all that much. So we tend to just ignore them and push them aside. We're so busy with our own lives that we don't see the goodness in other people. Not necessarily through Jesus, or religion, but just goodness in people.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the parables, isn't it, Ale, where he says, someone is like there's a flood or something, and like someone comes, he comes through other people, but the person doesn't want to get off the boat because they were just waiting for God
they keep saying, well, God is going to help me. God is going to help me. And then, this person dies, goes to heaven, and he or she is like, well, what happened? I thought you were going to help me. And God is like, well, I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter or whatever, and you kept pushing it aside. So we tend to not see it. We have this idea of how specific it should be, and we don't see beyond that.
Right. There's a like a well-known drawing of Jesus and Maria as like immigrants that like they're on a payphone. You guys have probably seen it, but it reminds me of that too. That no one notices if like would someone notice like if Jesus and Maria like come back as like immigrants and they're coming across the border, like they would probably be put in a cage, just like this administration is doing to
there were a few churches that called it out by putting their manger right. They're set up in cages.
Yeah,
that's a lot to draw out from these little poems, huh?
I think that's what I like about Jose. He doesn't have to write lengthy poems to say a lot. I mean, just this little poem, you can dig into it and spend hours, analyzing it.
Yeah. There's also the humor in it, that just like with the one about like there's no white people in heaven. I think I remember him reading this one live or like on YouTube, and it's pretty funny the way that he delivers it too. Because you think that, well, it's Jesus and like but it just turns out to be your cousin. Yeah. So the next one I wanted to talk about, but of course, Vaporu, Not Vaporu, is another of those Mexican staples, just like the food that we talked about. I grew up with it as a kid, and I'm sure a lot of you did, and you listeners out there as well. But if you didn't, it's kind of just like it is described here. Like it isn't just for like cough suppression, but pretty much, in Mexican culture, that's like the medicine. Like capital T and but I like here, just like Jose always does very skillfully. I like how he turns it into something that goes beyond just medicine. Where he says, put some vaporu on your forehead and watch forgiveness flush your cheeks. Put some vaporu on your bank account and watch the bill collector stop calling. When I forget a word in Spanish, take a teaspoon of vaporu under the tongue.
I'm going to try that.
which is what, right? Yeah, I mean, it's funny, because it's just what we were talking about, forgetting Spanish, forgetting your roots. And I like also how he kind of throws in the pronunciation, Vaporu. I don't know with you, Ale, like, I know you have Abby, and I don't know if it's coming handy.
I have a bottle at home, yeah. I try to always have one. You never know when you can use it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this one was funny to me. It was just so funny when he said miss a day at church, put some vaporu on your forehead. That was just hilarious how we can use it for everything. And I remember seeing a meme recently with the pandemic going on that said something like, Mexico's got this. They have Sprite, and Vaporu. So, they have the...
All right.
I saw, not recently, another one where it's like Mexicans always solve everything when the mom says Ponte Vix or something like that.
Yeah. Right.
But it's crazy. I want to look into it and see what the ingredients are, because it works for everything. I mean, it's...
Right. I think it's also an interesting example of like, he was talking about sleep apnea before, and like how in Mexican culture, because so many of us like are working class, or just plain broke. Like we can't afford a doctor, we don't have health insurance. So it also shows how like we got to be resourceful and, just find whatever it is like at the Walgreens, or like at the tiendita at the corner.
And more than likely you'll find this and not, high-end medicine. And, you learn to make do with what you have. And gratefully, Vaporub cures a lot of things. So,
yeah. So section 5 is the last section. And it's also the last Mexican heaven that it opens with, right? What do you guys think about it as like the
This was my favorite Mexican heaven out of all of them. Again, I thought it was funny. But it reminded me of... that 70s show, how they always get together in the basement and they're smoking weed. Yeah. And I mean, they're not Mexican, but it was just, I liked how it kind of explained what happens in a regular Mexican household. And I'm not saying all Mexican people smoke weed, but just in general, everything else, like the kids are somewhere doing something, and then mom is off to church, or mom and dad, are praying the rosary. And then when it says God threatens to kick all the Mexicans out of heaven si no paran con las pendejadas, I'm like, are there really no Mexicans in heaven? Because we're not going to stop with the pendejadas, It's part of being Mexican.
Yeah, well said.
I thought it was interesting,
Vanessa,
especially because it ends with saying that the cycle repeats all over again. So nothing really changes. And then I think Ala touched on the idea of how God is kind of represented as like being the religious Mexican mother in some ways, of the idea of how going to church and like, I'm going to kick you out of the house, that whole aspect of it, I think.
Yeah. The personage of God here, like you said, represented as like a strict, religious, devout Mexican mom or father, whatever, but I think mom, makes more sense. Is kind of seems like another of those twists, that Jose throws out there, whether it's Jesus being like your cousin, or there being no white people in heaven, along those lines, it's just this kind of like Mexican heaven is just full of surprises, and kind of seems like a letdown too, but
surprise.
But like you were saying, Ale, I do like the humor in it of like how they're hiding from God,
they go outside,
and, like they're drinking on the
smell
side.
The weed.
Yeah, family gatherings.
Yeah.
When you and cousins go out for a walk, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Right. What other ones did you all have from this section?
I had the next two
that follows.
First, pumped to take the belt out of my dad's hands. That one was just made me think of how Mexican parents educate their kids. They're always starting with the belt. Te voy a dar con el cinto, if you don't listen.
Yeah.
I don't know. It made me think the way things are now and how we're raising children in modern days. I think of how I'm raising my daughter and how we're raising more needy, sensitive kids. And when I read this poem, I was like, maybe that's what I need. I need to take off my belt a little more and discipline.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, I thought of my dad, my dad was never the kind to hit me a lot, but I was a very bad child. But my brother, he was, oh God, he was a troublemaker. And I remember my dad, like taking off his belt and being like, get us, I'm gonna do it. So we grew up being scared of the cinto, and even if he didn't use it that much, we're like, oh, we don't want him to.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in episode 2
is what you're
there's
saying,
the poem "Boy in the Belt" in section 1 that talks about it, and I remember my grandfather walking around and like you said, the threat of it. He never used it, but he would snap it in this very like scary way. I'm like, nope, okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm stopping right now. Look.
Yeah, or they would, like my dad would bang it against the wall and make it just snap and be like, that's how your butt's gonna sound if you don't listen.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an interesting twist on it, this type of child rearing where it's a little sad, I think. He talks about in the end of the stanza, it says, he doesn't reach for the belt is buried. He reaches for my head and rubs it soft. He says it's okay. I just think that's an interesting contrast to the earlier poem, Boy in the Belt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is interesting in a way that in the other one, the belt was we were getting the point of view from the belt. The belt was personified, and now the belt is underground and it has been disempowered. And there's a kind of soft love, tender moment that I think there was another poem. I don't know if it's in a section about the telling the dad I love you. Kind of.
And then it also made me think that the belt is not so much for punishment, but like education purposes. And it was the way he ended it that made me think that, because still under his hand, still crying. It just made me think like maybe his dad was just trying to educate him and teach him whatever it was he was trying to teach him. But that was the purpose of the belt. It wasn't to cause, physical pain or punishment, but educate his child.
What do you mean? Like if the kid wouldn't listen, the belt would
maybe
come in?
Just like you said, the threat was what was making him listen to his dad or do whatever he was supposed to do. Because it says at the top, I think it's the third line, it says, in this story, the belt acts alone. It is not his hands. He's watching TV, Sports Center, or whatever. And then it says that he would stop the belt if he could. So I think of it as a parent, and I'm like, I would stop myself from punishing my daughter, from putting her on timeout if I could. But if I do that, it's not going to teach her the lesson. It's not going to make her understand. So it's something that has to happen in order for the lesson to be learned.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Ale. The repetition of in this story kind of does emphasize that kind of the way that the belt is being used, like you said, right? Because we don't really get so much of the violence as we do in the other one, except where ironically it's the kid, like I grabbed the belt and beat myself with it.
Yeah.
And you said you also had the next one?
My mom texts me for the millionth time. Just that, how he opens up the poem. The phone vibrates. My mom buzzes my desk. Her love reaches me wherever I am, which is usually unavailable. Again, that it spoke volumes to me. There's right now being quarantined, we have a little more time and we get to call people and spend more time on the phone, not just texting. But I remember in the chaos of everyday life, school, work, my daughter, church, my husband, home, it's hard sometimes to receive that call and actually pick up the phone and have a conversation. I'm grateful I still have my mother, but it's sometimes very hard to actually engage. And where Nit said, my mom home with my family minus me. I mean, I'm not living there anymore, so I don't get to see my mother every day. I don't get to talk to her all the time like I used to. So it gave me a sense of longing, I guess, for the times, for when I was younger and I got to spend all that time with my mom. I don't know. It was a nice poem, and it really touched me.
Yeah. What did you all think? Like, did you all relate to it too?
I did, but I don't anymore because I do live with my mom, so I see her all the time now. So I'm with her every day. But usually when we're not in quarantine, I'm always at school. I go to work, and then I'm always like doing something. So I'm rarely home. But now I'm getting to spend this time with her and reconnect with the rest of my family as well. So it's something that I related to, but not so much at this moment.
Yeah, I like this is like a nice little love poem about his mom. I really love the way he transforms the imagery of her sitting on the couch with the glow of the TV, and then again his twist of it into, she makes it so effortless it's impossible to tell the light comes from her own body. And I think that's a nice, sweet little line there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Made me want to call my mom.
Yeah. And I think it's also the only one that is, because there's a couple here like as odes to his dad,
Her mom,
but I think it's the only one that's kind of an ode to his mom.
Yeah, I really love this one.
Did any of you have I Love the World, So I Married It?
I mean, I think it's another tribute. Like, if this fifth section is kind of more focused on family and love, this is a nice remembrance of his grandmother, and around the time it looks like she passes away. I think that's always such a. I guess every family is different, but the you lose a grandparent, it can mean so much. I think this is also another poem that he likes to read in public. Again, with great lines. I love that. I love the world, so I married it. And it talks about kind of like the dullness or sadness of losing his grandmother, because Ray says that there are mangoes, so I tasted nothing. But then he comes to enjoy. Right, the speaker comes to enjoy the world of carne asada and smoke up. And I think this is just kind of reference to, I think in a lot of there's a lot of funerals, the family gets together afterwards to remember the deceased, and usually it becomes like a little bit of a party. People bring food or eat, and it's a nice way to remember. And so it's just transformation, right? And he says even maybe it felt offensive to smile, and his grandma buried and getting eaten by the flowers. Interesting imagery there too. But I think that there's this realization here of that everyone's going to die, right? He mentions that. Then my uncle died, and I knew forever included none of my family, included no friends. Just this realness to it. It's an interesting take, right? But then he takes it as an opportunity to reflect on the things he really does enjoy in the world. Right, and he goes off and makes this great list, right, of wings, the honey of a slow kiss, music playlists, and again, my favorite part, just like in the previous poem, this really beautiful line for his mom. He has this other line where he remembers he hates when people call him Lopito, except the way his mother, his grandmother would say it. So I just thought it was a very moving poem.
Well, I think, when the way I think of it is the idea of marriage in this one is like the idea of living. And then towards the end of the poem, he says, I know I will divorce the world and let it keep my most treasured possession. And I think that by saying that, he means like, I'm no longer going to be here either. It's this idea of dying as well.
And therefore keeping the little things, right? Because these are things that we normally, it's like, everyday things, and I like the internal rhyme there of like a slow kiss, music playlist, and how the last line is on an island, unlike all the other ones, and kind of representing the exception of like how her grandmother was special, that only she could be the one to say Lupito, and
so affectionate.
it's so separate from the world that he's in love with, in a way.
Valuable to him.
Yeah.
I do.
Vanessa,
so
did you
this one
have
is
the next
Love
one?
Poem featuring Kanye West. And so we touched on this a little bit in the previous episodes, especially the album College Dropout, which is specifically named in this. I think that it's really nice how he uses these allusions to Kanye throughout, because it's like Chicago and it's his hometown. And this album was kind of like a big part of his life. I also like that it's dedicated to somebody.
Yeah, there's a couple. But I was thinking about that too. And maybe Erika, well, no. But I mean, this one does mention the grandmother dying again. But in terms of the Kanye allusion, like, what do you think is significant about that particular record? And it also mentions like
Slow
Suit Up
Jams
Special and Slow Jams. I don't know if those are like songs in the record. Or...
Trying to think of how to describe it. Well, Slow Jams is kind of the song where they're talking about, well, in the clubs, they always play fast songs, and we have to kind of slow it down so that it's more, I guess, romantic, I guess, is the way to put it.
Well, you know, when you think of slow jams, you think of like the slow dances, the smooth R&B, like romantic. You know, he talks about love language, and that's such a thing. You know, who speaks your love language? And so, a lot of hip hop uses samples, and so he references that here as well, right? It's a sample from a soul song, and it's sped up here in the song. But this is, I think, an interesting twist, because you know it starts off not so great. You were late to our date, and I like the humor of the waiter was about to offer the stood up special. I'm sorry, maybe next time. Here, have this drink. It's on the house. But instead of ending in that negative way, right? She shows up and they connect through this music, and it reminds me a lot of I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, right? When you see that connection as well, how two people could connect through music, through similar interests,
or even the Poet X.
Yeah, exactly. And so my favorite part about this is just the aspect of the very human element of when he needed it a lot, like when his grandmother died. Again, that's such a, or I guess when anyone dies close to you, right? It's very hard to deal with, and so any friend that's there for you means a lot. And so that's kind of what he says here, right? I don't know how love works, but I remember the day, and then he's just saying like I remember when I called, you answered. So I think that's a pretty nice aspect of maybe this didn't work out as a love, but you know that's still a very meaningful aspect that the speaker remembers about this person.
I think for me the focus of this poem was that not so much the featuring Kanye West, because I'm not too familiar with him. I'm not too familiar with his music and his story. But the part I focused on was the fact that it's a love poem, and it's for Erica. When it says, I don't know how love works, but I remember the day I called, you answered. And he even says, I don't know what we talked about on the phone. I don't remember what you said. I don't remember if it helped, you know, how I was feeling that my grandma died. I just remember you answered. And it made me think, like, just the fact that she was there. And the same could be true for all of us, you know, when somebody shows up, when somebody's there in a moment of need, that's what matters. Not so much maybe the words that they tell you or that you tell them, but the fact that you're present.
Yeah, that's very well said. You know, I mean, not like, it's just the idea that like, it, you know, it didn't work out for whatever reason, you know, but that even so, like, there's still the courtesy of like answering, and instead of just kind of totally,
I know that made me think of Stuck in Love,
you, like blocking you or whatever, you know,
when his mother dies, right, and she's there for him.
Yeah. And I was just thinking on what you said about this being a love poem also, that this section, I think, is all about love.
Food.
Love for a significant other, a parent, yourself, food. Yeah. Did any of you have
Well, I just have
any
the
other
last
ones from
one.
this one? I just had the gentrification.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Well, gentrification on 64 is a kind of play on words of gentrification. And I believe I've mentioned several times already that, I really like that show on Netflix called Gentrified. And it reminded me a lot of it. If you listeners out there haven't seen it, I really do recommend checking it out. It's an interesting show about cultura, and it's set in LA, where there is a lot of gentrification, and actually a lot of the episodes are about that conflict of selling out. And so I like how this poem, is also set there, or it references LA at least. And there's the referencing to the gentrification and like property value going down. White people take kale with them, like the white flight that we had talked about. But then there's a kind of bartering that happens in the second half where it says, we trade tortillas for haircuts, nopales for healthcare, poems for groceries. And if all you can do is eat the food, we ask that you wash your dishes. We get more desert, and from the desert, we get lowriders, cars bounce. And it goes on, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo rescinded. And so obviously there's a lot of like the things that are important to Mexican culture that they might not get or that they're willing to give up, because they do need that healthcare. They do need, food on the table. And they do need to be comfortable, like there's the reference to lowriders I kind of see as, the gangs, right? That is referenced here about cousins. And still like the abuelitas, give him the bendición, right? And so it's kind of an interesting poem of like the trade-offs and the way that you manage to balance things and still keep true to your cultura, and despite the fact that things might get more expensive, that you're broke, and there's a lot there that comes with because of that gentrification. And so it begins with planting that grain of sand, which is about being of the earth, being humble, and it ends with the grains of sand when the migra comes. So
I also
that's
like
why I liked it.
that it mentions the bad news, but immediately after it's followed by the good news. And the bad news is always like little short portions, and then the good news is a lot longer of a portion. And I like the lines. It says, rejoice in the good news. And then later on, at the bottom of page 64, it says the whole block is alive. And I think it's that importance of keeping our cultures alive and giving back to our own communities.
Exactly. Alive and not for sale, and kind of is a good way of representing how people fight back against gentrification, against like, the hijacking of and co-opting of, what it starts off with, the juicers in El Barrio, which is like very dissonant of an image. Ale and Richie, did you all have thoughts on this one too?
I liked how he uses things we're familiar with. Like from the tortillas, we get more dessert. From the dessert, we get lowriders. It's things we know. It's things we grew up with. I remember seeing lowriders drive down the street growing up. And I mean, tortillas, we eat them every day. It's just very relatable. I guess I should say I just like how it's also towards the end of the entire book.
Yeah.
Because it kind of wraps up the book by putting it all together.
Yeah, I mean, I like this. This one kind of gels with the more politically charged poems in the collection. And you guys hit up on a lot of the, I think, salient points that I think are already worth talking about. So just to kind of add to that, I really like I guess kind of the mixing of cultures he's mentioning earlier on. Like, you know, the good news is my boy Nate is teaching poetry workshops in the shade. Gwendolyn Brooks smelled the tamales and came down the right. Then, of course, when it changes this idea of again being labeled, and it kind of goes back to the whole systemic kind of inequalities happening, where economic value talking about economists say there's zero economic value in our block. The good news is we threw away the economics textbooks, and that's where they go into the barter system. So again, it's kind of like you said, managing to stay alive, right, and not for sale, kind of not losing that spirit despite all that. You know, the National Guard coming in, La Migra coming in, and in a way, I don't know. I really like this last line of, you know, their dogs bark and spit, but all they find is grains of sand. I think that's an interesting way to end it. Is that we're resilient, and we're maybe even referencing migration, right? We need to move if we have to, but that's just kind of forced by everything else.
Yeah, I think you really made a good point about how it kind of does connect a lot of the other poems and brings a lot of cultures together, you know, because it does mention Salvadorans and, you know, Gwendolyn Brooks, like you said. Nate Marshall is, I presume, who is the reference here, who's an African-American poet. Yeah. Well, the last one here, Guapo, is
I
something
really love that this is the last
Vanessa, I think you said you
poem
wanted
in the
to talk
collection,
about, right?
because it is focused on this idea of self-love, and that isn't something that we really see throughout the collection. So I think it's a really nice way to end it. This idea of talking to himself and complimenting himself in the mirror, I think, is really a nice touch.
And sorry, which line is that?
Does he mention it? I might have just assumed he's looking in the mirror because he's looking at himself.
I think it does say it somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, just the opening line, right? You know, I heard, like, there's a lot of looking. So, yeah. And Vanessa, what do you make of the italicized
that he's calling
portions?
himself these names. That these are who he identifies himself as. And he gives different names. Yeah.
And he finishes with well, yeah, I mean, no, yeah, I was just like, he finishes with like adopting Wapo as like his only name. And it's kind of interesting how you identify this as self-love and how it seems like, you know, given the other poems, because it's the only one and it closes with it, is like the importance of it, like you mentioned, and how the speaker here does struggle with like self-image, and, you know, whether it's someone seeing like they're either too fat or too skinny, you know, I think he's talked about that. And so it's kind of important, right, in terms of like your self-esteem, your motivation to just, you know,
and appreciating every part of who you are.
You might as well, right? So
not just the self-love, but appreciating the little things too. It's like in the middle when it says, "I shoddy," what it is. I say to my freckled chest, to the red bumps I used to hide under the t-shirts, ugly as hell, but all mine. You know, that's he's even appreciating the things he doesn't like about himself, and he's owning them. He's owning them, and he's acknowledging the fact that every little detail makes him be who he is.
Like even right before that, he mentions a scar that he has. So not only is he talking about his feet and his legs, he talks about his scars, he talks about his freckles, he talks about his hair. Like he separates each part of himself and talks about it and compliments himself.
And then he acknowledges where he got things from, like his hairline.
Yeah.
He got it from his dad. His face, he got it from his mom. He's giving credit to where he came from.
Yeah. I think from a male perspective, it's interesting too, you know, because normally like self-image, and I think you, Richie, had mentioned there's an allusion to Narcissus in another poem. Is we normally don't expect that from men, you know, unless like they're, you know, like metrosexual. Like, I mean, I don't want to stereotype, but I think in general, you know, us who identify as guys, like we don't necessarily focus too much on our self-image. And so I think it kind of breaks that gender role and gender archetype, I should say, of, you know, you don't really care about the way that you look, but here it is about, well, you do got to love yourself. You know, you do got to take care of your body and love your body, you know, before you love someone else. And I think it's interesting in terms of that, and it kind of does break the mold.
And even if guys do love themselves, I think sometimes it's hard for men, especially to express how they feel, how about themselves, you know, because then they don't want to get labeled or. For a girl, I think it's easier, you know, to say, "Oh, I look cute in this dress. I like how my makeup came out." But for a man, if he says a comment like that, it's a little more like, okay, you're a dude, you know, like don't.
It comes
don't
off more as
like
being vain than just being able to compliment themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you know, I agree with Vanessa. I'm glad that this is.
Richie, did you have any thoughts on this one?
A little bit of self-love in a book that covers so much, and in this section in particular, right, talks about the different kinds of love. Here you have, you know, a moment for him to stop and appreciate himself, right? You got to kind of give yourself that self-love from time to time, you know, because you're worth it, you know, even through the imperfections, like you were saying, Ale, because I those stood out to me as well. You know, and I like that he starts at his feet, right? I hardly ever look at them, and so, you know, it's kind of cool how he, hello left foot, hello right foot, and he names them his favorite name, Guapos. So it's kind of, you know, more of that humor, that lightheartedness, but you know, I agree with you a lot too, Jorge, that, you know, it does kind of turn on its head. It's not a typical thing. Like from my own experience, you know, when I got into poetry in high school, oh my God, the flack I got. I mean, I inhibited several different worlds in high school too. You know, I was part of the literary magazine there at my high school, but I also played sports. You know, I was in baseball, and sometimes, you know, especially in high school, there's a lot of immaturity, right? We're very culturally small-minded, but oh my God, the fact that I you know, was into poetry and writing it and reading it, I got some pretty dumb commentary from the guys, and so it's nice to be able to see this here in this poem, and just, yeah, some self-love. Go practice some self-love, guys.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, that's a good way of wrapping up this whole collection. You know, it's been 4 episodes now, and Ale, we wanted to thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really
time out of your day to
enjoyed
do this.
it. I've never done a podcast before, so it's a good experience. I really liked it.
Cool. Well,
perfect. Yeah, sounds great.
You know, we'll have this one out soon, so I'll send you the link. Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah. If you want to just because I know you got things to do.
Yeah.
You got Abby there and Manny. Send my regards to them, and
soon, hopefully,
we should, get
'cause
together once all this
I'm going crazy.
ends, whenever it does.
But well, yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much
I think we all are,
for
but
having me and thinking of me to do this.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you guys so
Bye.
much. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
You too.
Yeah.
Stay safe.
Bye. Take care.
Cool.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing Citizen Illegal by Jose Olivares. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep. And happy National Poetry Month.